It was 2009 when WGBH turned its powerhouse signal 89.7 into a news format, taking on rival WBUR, who was long entrenched in news. The two stations often carry much of the same network programming, including Morning Edition and All Things Considered, but of course they have different local shows. It worked for quite a while, even though the duplicate effort was questioned really from the get-go. Now, for the first time, WGBH is conceding a merger might be a good idea. President and CEO Susan Goldberg told the Globe, with the loss of government funding, maybe the two should talk. All right, well, WBUR's Margaret Lowe didn't exactly jump at the idea. So, Scott, you've looked into this, kind of taken a deep dive into the finances there. I mean, there's a ton
Sure.
of duplicate stuff here. They both carry multi-million dollar loans on their buildings, these fancy new buildings that both built. Um, the executive salaries are outrageous. I mean, they just are. $750,000 for one person, 550,000 for executives are pulling in these hundreds of thousands of dollars. Even their advisors, consultants are making $250,000. Former President and CEO John Abbott is pulling in $250,000. But how do you think this could work? Because I mean, they're not going to give up their signals, 89.7 and 90.9. I mean, no one's going to concede a signal. So how could it work?
Right. Yeah, it's a tricky situation, right? You got these huge egos and people
Yeah.
making large amounts of money, and but you do have, you would just looking at it, you would seem like you have overlap that they could work together on or save some money on. I mean, if you add up the marketing, underwriting, uh, fundraising, the amount of money spent either on outside help or through their own staff, it's tens of millions of dollars. Do they need separate fundraising teams, or do they need if you combine two stations, you need
Yeah.
two
It could be just
CEOs.
like give to Public Radio Boston or something like that. And they would go to both of them. Yeah.
Right, and then you could put keep your reporters, and then maybe instead of competing with each other, they could. I mean, it's good to compete, but do more. Don't do the same story from a slightly different angle, but do dig into deeper into what's happening locally. But that's probably a pipe dream. I mean, it's difficult to get the any organization to merge, and there's some obviously institutional, cultural issues that go way back and different ways of approaching things and big egos. So.
Yeah.
It seems like there's money there that wouldn't involve getting rid of reporters that you could put towards your mission.
Well, Dan, WBUR is really entrenched in the academic environment. In fact, it's used as a training ground to some extent. GBH is a foundation. And the one thing they have going for themselves that's completely different is that they are really you know, the master station for PBS network, Frontline and Nova and all those things. So, and it's just, although it's not really shot there, it's all over the world. But I mean, no one's going to concede that. I mean, I keep imagining how this can work, and I think on the local level, it could. In some level, but yeah, somebody's going to have to give something up. And what is that? What does it look like, Dan?
Well, I don't know why we would want this to happen. I think having two public radio stations devoted to news and public affairs, both of which have some local programming, is good for Boston and good for the listeners. And if Margaret Lowe of WBUR was saying, we're really in trouble, we think this is a good idea, then maybe we ought to pay attention to what's going on. But instead, she's saying, we have no interest in this. And what I thought was
Oh, she
most
didn't she say we should maybe talk? Because I think it's not that people want it to happen, Dan. I think they think, maybe it's not sustainable the way it is.
well, Margaret Lowe doesn't seem to be taking that position. Susan Goldberg seems to be taking the position that it's not sustainable from GBH's point of view, but it doesn't sound like Margaret Lowe is interested in helping Susan Goldberg solve her problems. And I would really love to see GBH Radio continue as its own thing and WBUR continue as its own thing. Margaret Lowe seems to think it can continue to work, so I would love to see that happen.
Laura, there have been some newspapers that have tried this in the past. I remember doing a story years ago on
Mhm.
Beat the Press about it, but I mean, it's fraught with, a lot of it has to do with ego. There's no question about it because you've got a number of big local media stars,
Mhm.
Magna Chakrabarty at BUR, Jim Browdy and Marjorie Egan at GBH, and then all those morning anchors and everything. I mean, some of them are pretty big names too. You'd only need one.
So, about 35, nearly 40 years ago, I worked at the Syracuse Post-Standard. And it was right after that's the morning city paper. And it was right after it had merged with the evening city paper. And one of the things that happened was certain departments got blended together. We didn't need two separate lifestyle bureau, departments. We didn't need multiple bureaus in other towns, which is a thing that newspapers used to do back in the day. They had separate metro desks because even now at the Globe, you have news coming in at all hours. So you have separate shifts. Instead, they had separate desks. The copy desk was made into a universal desk, and other departments like marketing um, and um, and other things were merged. These days, could BUR and GBH merge their social media, their marketing, their fundraising, those shared departments? Sure, they probably could, and it wouldn't cause any sort of adverse actions to the two radio stations. But I'm with Dan. I don't think anyone would say that it's a good thing to have only one public radio station if you can help it. Maybe there's a way they can adjust programming. Maybe they can figure out a way to divvy up the big shows. I'm also reminded of what just happened like a year ago in Rhode Island when the Rhode Island PBS station merged with the public's radio. And now the two combined are called Ocean State Media. You wouldn't think that would cause a lot of problems. One's radio, one's TV. They're kind of becoming like GBH, right? In fact, they're headed now by Pam Johnson, who used to
Right.
be in charge of GBH's
Yeah.
newsroom. But there was a ton of fallout. There were redundant CMSs, content management systems for the two websites. There was overlap in the news division. There were programs that they just stopped airing on TV, and now they're only on YouTube or on Instagram Reels, and I'm not sure who sees them. There were multiple sets and talent, and entire departments left.
Hmm.
And so now what you have is a new media organization that is the PBS radio and PBS TV station for the state, but doesn't look much like what it used to, and frankly, doesn't necessarily cover the things that it used to the way it used to.
So it's not better.
I think some people probably think it is, but I think it depends on what you are getting out of it. It still carries a lot of the PBS programming from the PBS mothership, but it's a cousin station to GBH, so it doesn't get things immediately when they run, unless it's their own programming, but they don't have a ton of local programming.
Hmm.
So I think we have to wait and see. It's very telling that the head of GBH and the head of BUR don't really want to merge, but maybe there are cost savings that can be had if they talk.
Well, as we all know here on Beat the Press,
Mhm.
another distinction that GBH had was its local television programming.
Mhm.
But that was completely dismantled about 5 years ago, starting with this program, and then one by one they canceled every single one of them. But it was a local distinction, and it made them, special in the community for a number of reasons. But that went away, and so really all they have left is radio, and of course the national programming on the television side. But the radio is very redundant, so that's an issue.
The audio preview.